So continuing our discussion on Blue Marvel, we pick back up with Adam Brashear during his first encounter with Tony Stark, Reed Richards, and Hank Pym, but we also get a little more insight into the history of his character and the answer to the question of how he gained his powers. So the story initially opens with Adam Brashear in amphibious naval base Little Creek in North Carolina. Now something I'd like to point out here is that in real life, this naval base is actually in Norfolk, Virginia, and deals with offensive naval operations and deploying soldiers overseas and into hostile shores. But the basis behind Graveau bringing us this part of the story is to focus on the history of Adam Brashear and Connor Sims, the Ant-Man. What we learn here is that contrary to previous depictions of white Americans in the story up to this point, not everyone was racist during Adam's time prior to becoming the Blue Marvel. In this instance, Adam was dealing with some racist members of the Navy, and where previously he would remain hands-off rather than facing dishonorable discharge for conduct unbecoming of an officer by way of fighting, he along with Connor Sims finally fought back and gave the soldiers a lesson in humility. Now transitioning to the present day, we join Adam Brashear alongside Tony Stark, Reed Richards, and Hank Pym aboard the SHIELD helicarrier above New York. Something I'd like to mention here is that where I'm normally straightforward on what I like and dislike about a section of a story in comics, in this instance, I'm actually on the fence here. The reason why is that with Adam Brashear arriving on board the helicarrier, Stark extends an olive branch of friendship to Brashear by offering a formal apology on behalf of the United States, and that the president himself would like to formally welcome Blue Marvel back to the superhero landscape. However, Brashear doesn't really want to hear it, and where he states that his intention is to focus on the here and now by providing the group with his knowledge of Ant-Man, to be quite frank, I don't think this was the right road to take. Now this is something that we'll get further into here in a second, but at the moment, the conversation shifts its focus to Ant-Man himself. According to Reed, the issue that they face is that Ant-Man is wildly powerful, more so than anyone that the Avengers have ever faced before. Now to be clear, this does not mean that the Ant-Man is the most powerful being in existence. Cosmic entities like Galactus and others are still far beyond anything that Ant-Man is capable of. It's simply that within the context of Earth-based villains, none of the Avengers have fought anyone like this before. Something else that Graveau does here is provide us with an understanding of just how intelligent Adam Brashear is, and saying that he knows his way around a science lab, but that he also knows the exact method in terms of how Ant-Man's powers work, and the reason for this comes in the form of Brashear's backstory. What we're told is that at some point during the careers of himself and Ant-Man, Connor Sims had become part of Army intelligence while Brashear worked on a project involving harnessing the power of antimatter as a source of energy. While the military had intended to weaponize this power before it was released to the general public for other applications, at some point and for reasons unknown, the experiment went awry, bathing both Adam Brashear and Connor Sims in antimatter energy. Where Sims was able to pull Brashear from the wreckage, Sims appeared to have succumbed to the energy and was completely obliterated. As a result, Connor Sims became the Ant-Man while Brashear became the Blue Marvel. Now what Graveau is doing here is providing us with the basis behind Blue Marvel's power, but to be honest, he doesn't really do the best job explaining exactly what Brashear is capable of in clear and simple terms. Having said that, the best way to think of Blue Marvel is that he is a less powerful version of Franklin Richards. Where Franklin can manipulate all matter in existence regardless of whether it be normal matter or antimatter, Adam Brashear is powered by and can only manipulate antimatter. What this means is that if Brashear were to enter the negative zone, he would be godlike in terms of his ability to manipulate and control all things within that space. But within the normal universe, he's capable of incredible strength, speed, and durability, but also has enhanced senses and the like. At the same time, the Ant-Man is the same way, but the best way I can explain his powers would be to say that he is an incomplete version of Blue Marvel. Ant-Man has all the same abilities as Brashear, but his control over them is not as acute, and his molecular structure is literally unstable. Now back to the conversation at hand regarding Brashear, Stark, Reed, and Pym. Hank's initial question is that if Brashear was watching the world unfold following the assassinations of Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., he had to notice that the world was improving. What Pym's basically saying here is that Brashear could have come back at any point in time, and despite what he might say about having his choices limited, at the end of the day, at least some part of his isolation was voluntary. However, according to Brashear, his view is that the President of the United States had requested that he step down, and that in his mind, defying a request from the President on that level would break the law. As the one thing that holds society together and keeps anarchy from reigning supreme, in the eyes of Brashear, maintaining the law is of the utmost importance. Now returning to our discussion on the attempt at Stark to apologize for his past actions of the United States and its rejection by Brashear, Where Adam leaves to take care of personal matters, this concept is discussed further by Reed, Tony, and Pym. Where Hank doesn't seem to grasp why it is that Brashear takes the attitude that he does, Graveau establishes Reed as the voice of reason and does this by using the idea of mutants as an example of how prejudice still exists within the realm of Marvel Comics. What Reed tells us is that where the Avengers or the Fantastic Four operate to save the world, whenever they're successful in quelling a threat, they're lauded as heroes, but when the X-Men perform the same act, they're shunned by humanity. To Reed, prior to the birth of Franklin followed by Valeria, he had never had any reason to pay any attention to the affairs of mutants and the issues that they faced in society. However, because both his children are mutants with incredible powers by way of Franklin's ability to warp reality and Valeria's genius-level intellect, the issues faced by mutants came into full swing. And so what Graveau is doing here is making an analogy by comparing the position of Reed before and after the birth of his children to the position of America following the advent of nationwide media. What I mean here is that during the time of regional news, the racial issues in the United States were only really known by intelligence organizations under the government and individuals residing in the areas whose issues were most prevalent. However, following the advent of nationwide news, families on one side of the country could see what was happening on the other side, and as a result, the totality of racism in the United States was thrown into view for the world to see, leading to a massive upheaval regarding how American citizens viewed the nation as a whole. Now picking back up with Brashear, we transition to his underwater fortress in the Mariana Trench within the Atlantic Ocean. As the largest cavern in the world and deep enough to house Mount Everest with room to spare, the trench was a perfect location for Blue Marvel's base of operations, and that the only person who would have been able to access it would have been Namor the Submariner. Greeting his old friend, this particular moment is very important for several reasons. The first is that it goes towards establishing how long Brashear had operated as a superhero and that Namor had predated Brashear, but the two of them were extremely close friends. The second is that because the two were friends, this establishes that in the eyes of Namor, Brashear was an honorable man, which is something rarely found, and that Namor pretty much hates everyone else. What we're also told is that regarding his physical strength, Brashear is on par with both Thor and the Incredible Hulk, something that's stated by Namor, and that when he and Brashear had first met, the two had fought one another due to Namor's belief that Brashear was simply invading his oceans. The final reason why the encounter between the two is so important is due to the fact that Namor actually assuages Brashear from abandoning the Avengers and leaving them to their own devices and attempting to defeat the Anti-Man. Where Brashear voices his irritation over the nature of politics and that he was previously asked to step down, but is now being asked to come back even after learning that he spent his whole life being monitored, Namor uses his experience fighting among the invaders to provide a measure of perspective. What Namor says here is that when he fought alongside Captain America, Bucky Barnes, and Jim Hammond during World War II, he was also fighting alongside what were referred to as Red Tails. Now the Red Tails was a nickname for pilots who painted the tails of their planes red, but the official name for this group was the Tuskegee Airmen. As African Americans fighting during World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen were a real-world element in society, but because African Americans were looked down upon during this time, the Tuskegee Airmen were considered unintelligent and largely treated as cannon fodder. However, in the eyes of Namor, they were the true embodiment of bravery, and that through it all, they never turned their backs on a fight, were always the first ones in and the last ones out. Using this as a platform, Namor makes the case that regardless of the conflict faced by any one man, there's always a choice to be made regarding whether or not to act, and there will always be evil in the world. As a result, those with the power to confront that evil have a responsibility to do so, even if it flies in the face of everything that they believe, and this logic is based solely on the idea that should they not act, the evil of individuals in the world would reign supreme. And so taking the words of Namor to heart, Brashear dons his Blue Marvel uniform with the intention of returning to Reed, Stark, and Pym, and ally himself in their efforts to defeat the Anti-Man. However, before he can achieve this, Connor makes his return to confront Adam for the first time since their last encounter in the 1960s. Now what Graveau does here is provide us with the final piece of the backstory between Sims and Brashear. What we learn here is that following the experiment that gave them their powers, Sims had somehow rematerialized, after which he had been taken to Brashear's underwater facility. Where Sims initially greeted Brashear as a friend, Sims was informed that he had been in a coma for a month. Furthermore, after analyzing his molecular structure, Brashear came to the conclusion that Sims' molecules were essentially breaking down on the atomic level, meaning that he appeared to be dying. However, for Sims, the end of his existence as a normal human and rebirth through the power of antimatter made him mentally unstable, and through his insanity, he had come to the conclusion that society's racism and prejudice needed to be eliminated to make way for a utopia of sorts, even if it required the destruction of all life. At the same time, where Bashir tries to reason with Sims and recalling some of the get-togethers that their families had shared with the two becoming godfather to the other's children, in the end, Sims came to the belief that Bashir had stolen his family away from him. However, Adam counters this by stating that the instability of Sims put not just society, but his own family in danger. As such, Bashir hid Sims' family away under the belief that he could reason with Sims and restore him to normalcy. Furthermore, Bashir tries to help Sims understand that the world isn't the way that it used to be, and while there will always be prejudice in the world as is human nature, the landscape of open racism is no longer an issue and that people are more acceptable than they were before. But despite all of this reasoning, in the end, Sims believes that Bashir's willingness to give society a chance to demonstrate the steps it's taken towards acceptance is an inherent weakness, and that if Bashir has truly allied himself with humanity, then he's just as guilty as everyone else. And so as this issue comes to a close, Sims attacks Bashir, knocking him unconscious in the process, and uses the opportunity to continue his campaign against humanity and his goal of eliminating all life on the planet Earth. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and let me know what you guys think about this issue so far. And I will catch you guys later. Peace.